Hello, welcome to our history podcast. My name is Dr. S. Mocker, and today we're going to continue talking about the cultural shifts and rights movement of the 1960s. So, last session we talked about civil rights, the shift to the Black Power movement, and a growing anti-war movement to protest American involvement in Vietnam. Today, we're going to talk all about hippies and religion and women's rights and LGBTQ and Latino and Native Americans. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court too. Why? Well, we'll get there. All right, so let's dive right in and talk about that part of the 1960s you probably associate most with the decade, the counterculture movement. So when people think of the 60s, usually they think like tie-dye, the peace symbol, right? Free love, and hippies. So what we call the counterculture, or this pushback at this mainstream kind of conformity of the 1950s, really emphasized this sense of personal liberation, that your goal as a American should not be to get that corporate job, get married, have a house in the suburbs with a car in the garage and 2.5 or 3.2 or however many children. Instead, that there were other ways to find fulfillment and success. And part of the reason why there's this shift is there's this great sense of disillusionment among the baby boom generation due to the Vietnam War. It shattered their faith in government and in society. Many of them, and the kind of leading edge of the baby boom generation, had already been pushing back against this notion of cultural conformity through uh, listening to rock and roll music in the 1950s. And so we see an acceleration of this as we get into the 60s and more baby boomers come of age. There's this desire to reject this expectation of what they should do or what their success or fulfillment should look like. This is the first time that there's a significant rejection in the mainstream for preconceived social conventions. So in many ways, it became popular to push back against mainstream. So in effect, dissent becomes mainstream in the 1960s. We see this experimentation through things like fashion, embracing relationships that looked different, and also experimenting with sex and drugs. So there's an emphasis less on finding fulfillment through consumption and more on personal exploration, on trying to free yourself from the shackles of bureaucracy and convention. And so this is where that phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll comes in to describe the 1960s. In particular, this concept of free love pushed back at this notion of monogamy and heterosexual relationships being the only acceptable relationships in mainstream culture, that you should feel free to love whomever you want, however you wanted. And part of what's driving this is, again, we saw a little bit of this with the Beats movement in the 1950s among college students, but we also now have advances in birth control. In 1960, the birth control pill hits the market for the first time. This really helps to emphasize that sex does not necessarily always have to be for reproduction or procreation, that sex is sometimes just something that people do for fun and for pleasure. However, not everybody gets access to the birth control pill when it first comes out. In fact, initially, there are a lot of rules that the birth control pill can only be accessed by married women with a prescription from their doctor. Many states, in fact, restricted even further than that. So, really, the role of the pill in liberating women from expectations of reproduction when it came to sex is really not going to be immediately felt when it comes out in 1960. As far as drugs go, while marijuana is still a very popular drug of choice in the 1960s, there's also a lot of experimentation with LSD, which was a psychedelic drug initially thought to expand the mind. The US government did a lot of experimentation, particularly the CIA, on the effects of LSD on the brain and on the human population. And then when it comes to rock and roll drastically evolves from the age of Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley. As we move into the 60s, we have rock festivals like Woodstock, held in 1967, which was a huge festival of music performed at by artists like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. And rock and roll moves into much more of this kind of heavy sort of sound than was characteristic in the 1950s. And many people identified Woodstock as a public articulation of the hippie movement. But really, if you were looking for the center of the counterculture and for hippies, you'd need to go to San Francisco. There are many communities that pop up across the United States. Many groups establish communes. About 2,000 of these communes pop up across the United States, which in many ways echoed the earlier utopian community movement before the Civil War in the United States, with an attempt to reject mainstream cultural values and to create a more perfect society. But really, the height of the counterculture is the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood in San Francisco. In places like the Castro district, this is where we have the center of this expression of free love and of experimentation. Now, even though we associate counterculture with free love, sex, drugs, rock and roll, there's also a very interesting component of religion in the counterculture movement in the 1960s. In some ways you might expect, and in some ways you might not expect. For example, Catholics in the 1960s were very heavily focused on social justice movements. The Second Vatican Council, which was held between 1962 and 1965, significantly changes the church. For example, it will not be official church policy to conduct Mass in the local language rather than in Latin. So if you have older members of your family, maybe a grandmother who's Catholic, who remembers what the Catholic Church was like before Vatican II, then you might have some clashes over how church services are conducted. These reforms, as well as the event of the 1960s, help to push a lot of Catholic clergy to participate in protest movements to help advance social and economic equality, particularly because a lot of people of color and immigrants were their parishioners, right? Were members of the Catholic Church and would benefit from these rights movements. And in many ways, the Catholic involvement in social justice movements is very similar to the earlier social gospel movement that we talked about at the tail end of the Gilded Age, right? This belief that religious people should, to further a community of Christ, push not only for immediate charity for people in need, but also for significant legislative change to enact long-term reforms. Eventually, this strain of social justice within the Catholic Church will cause a little bit of a rift within the church, as there are some people who believe that the Catholic Church should not be involved in anything remotely controversial. We also see within Protestant Christianity an attempt to cater to this counterculture movement. This is a movement we call the Jesus people, or more popularly Jesus freaks, which were religious hippies. So these were hippies who were born again. This is where Christian themed rock music comes from, is this time period. So you can thank/blame depending upon your personal liking of the genre or dislike this time period for this. And they also established their own kind of communes or utopian communities to try to embrace what they felt was a more approachable version of Christianity. So in many ways, you can kind of think of this as like the 1960s version of today's sort of hipster Christians, if that makes sense. Probably less surprising to you is the fact that as the counterculture becomes more dominant in the United States, we have experimentation in religions that don't traditionally have as big of a foothold in the United States. Buddhism and Hinduism both start attracting attention during the 1950s within the Beats movement, but gain increasing popularity in the 1960s. The practice of yoga and meditation, which had been prior to that point heavily associated with Buddhism and Hinduism, start to become decoupled from those religions and instead seen as a form of spiritual and physical health that was independent of Buddhism and Hinduism. And we still see that interpretation of yoga in most places today. But the counterculture also sets up the opportunity for potential abuse of religion in the form of cults. Religious cults occur throughout history. They're oftentimes devoted to an autocratic leader, so somebody who has total authority and control, but still maintains a lot of charisma, very charismatic personality to draw people into the cult. And a classic example of this in the United States is Jim Jones and the People's Temple. So Jim Jones starts this church called the People's Temple in Indiana, and he gets a lot of followers because he preaches a message of tolerance, of being against racism. And so he develops an interracial community of followers. And eventually, Jim Jones preaches that there's no way for the People's Temple to achieve this vision of racial harmony in the United States, that they had to go elsewhere to establish their ideal utopian community. So eventually, Jim Jones and the People's Temple will relocate to South America, to the country of Guyana, where in 1978, preaching apocalypse, Jim Jones and his followers engage in a mass murder suicide where about 900 people die. If you've ever heard the phrase, drink the Kool-Aid, that comes from the People's Temple because many people were killed by drinking Kool-Aid laced with poison. So this was done by his followers because they believed that it was the end times, right? Like this was the apocalypse, this was go time, and that they were ready to lay down their lives for this.